I want you to imagine a terrorist group that isn't out to kill you personally, but will certainly celebrate if it succeeds in killing your friends and family. And I want you to imagine that the leaders of this terrorist group, rather than do the killings themselves, cynically encourage embittered teenagers to do their dirty work for them. Now, what if an official from this group were doing a TV interview and they made a claim for which they didn't have a shred of evidence? And what's more, they had every incentive to make this claim whether it was true or not, because it made them look a bit better. Wouldn't you suspect that maybe there's just a small possibility they might be telling porcupines? I ask you this because on the 14th of May, less than a month after Israel celebrated 70 years of independence, the Israeli army killed around 60 Palestinians in clashes with protesters who were trying to storm the border fence in Gaza. Even Stephen Pollard, the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, was clearly disturbed. Yesterday was a shameful day. Yes, Hamas exploited, even organised much of the protests. Yes, no one would have been killed if they'd not been charging at the border. But no one can tell me that the correct response was to fire live ammunition at unarmed Palestinians. And JC columnist Daniel Sugarman was of much the same mind. There are ways to disperse crowds which do not include live fire. But the IDF has made an active choice to fire live rounds and kill scores of people. You cannot tell me that Israel, a land of technological miracles which have to be seen to be believed, is incapable of coming up with a way of incapacitating protesters that does not include gunning dozens of them down. But no, in front of the entire world, Israel keeps shooting and protesters, including young protesters, keep dying. Strong stuff. But a group of activists went further and staged a public Kaddish in Parliament Square.
Palestinians stand resolute on the Gazan border, demanding their freedom and their right to return. They are not committing acts of terrorism, they are performing a mitzvah.
Well, maybe not when they're running towards the security barrier with petrol bombs and machetes and explosives. Anyway, I'm interrupting. This guy doesn't look happy.
50 of them were identified as Hamas officers by the leader of Hamas. Look, it's all over here. Salah al-Badawi says openly 50 of those kills on Monday were Hamas officers. You're fucking pricks. You're saying Kaddish for them? You're saying Kaddish for them? They would have fucking killed you if you were there. They would have killed you if you're...
Useful guy to have at the Battle of Cable Street, but I wouldn't want to deal with him when he's drunk on Simchas Torah.
You're worried about fucking children? You prick, you! You fucking prick!
But it isn't just people who talk in words of one syllable. David Collier is a self-styled anti-Semitism researcher, best known for exposing Jeremy Corbyn's friends on Palestine Live. True to form, David set about naming and shaming more than 20 so-called ringleaders of the Kaddish, with a view to their being excluded from Jewish public life and from any involvement in educating Jewish youth. And even the more tactful Joseph Cohen from the Israel advocacy movement didn't mince his words.
So that's what happened to Neturei Carter when they stood in solidarity with Hamas. But what about this young group of Jews that said Kaddish? Well, one of the things that really stood out to me was the high proportion of youth Jewish leaders from the Reform and Liberal Jewish streams. What I mean by youth leader is if you belong to Reform or Liberal Judaism and you're thinking of sending your children on tour, it's these young individuals that were saying Kaddish that will be educating your children about Israel. They'll be passing on their Zionist education to your children. That's a pretty scary prospect.
Okay, so the Kaddish people have got their view, Joseph Cohen's got his, you probably got your view. You know what they say, if you put two Jews together, you get three opinions. But where it starts to get strange is that a few days later, Daniel Sugarman from the Jewish Chronicle has done a complete U-turn. I said Israel should be ashamed. Now I am the one ashamed. But what really affected me the most was yesterday when a Hamas operative went on television and claimed that of the 62 people killed in the last 2 days, 50 were Hamas operatives. 50? Haven't I heard that figure somewhere before?
Look, it's all over here. Salah al-Badawi says openly 50 of those kills on Monday were Hamas officers.
And what about Joseph Cohen?
The difficulty for me with that is that the majority of casualties were actually Hamas operatives. Out of the 60 or so people who were killed in the recent outburst of violence, out of the 60, over 50, according to Hamas, were Hamas operatives. They've actually named at least 24 of them.
And David Collier also seems to be mesmerised by this figure. During the early hours of May the 16th, the news broke that Hamas had publicly identified 50 of the fatalities as being operatives. What this meant was that the list of 60 names the organisers were carrying with them was effectively a list of terrorists. The nature of the event had changed from a distasteful act of virtue signalling into a group of Jewish people about to say Kaddish for Hamas terrorists. But hang on a moment, we're talking about Hamas here, one of the sickest terrorist organisations in the world. Are you sure they're telling the truth? The IDF doesn't appear to think so. Even with a little help from Shin Bet, they couldn't come up with more than 24 for Hamas and Islamic Jihad combined. And in the same Times of Israel report, Hamas claimed that only 13 of their operatives were from Hamas or Islamic Jihad. So where does this figure of 50 come from? Well, it comes from an interview on a Gazan TV station, which was reported and translated by memory.
كثير من الناس دكتور بيقولوا انه اولاد انا بقول لك اللي بينحكى طبعا انا مش مقتنع فيه لكن يقال اولاد الناس بروحوا بموتوا وحماس تجني الثمار.
طب ما احنا تحيرنا اذا كان الجوله الاخيره استشهد 62 شهيد،
نعم،
منهم 50 شهيد من حماس و12 شهيد من ابناء الناس. طب كيف يعني حماس تجني الثمار اذا دفعت هذا الثمن الباهظ؟ شو جنت؟ يعني 50 شهيد،
هذه ارقام
انا بقول لك رقم رسمي. 50 شهيد من حماس استشهدوا في هذه المعركة الأخيرة. قبل ذلك تستطيع أن تقول 50% على الأقل من الشهداء من حماس.
طيب
ما هو الثمن، ما هو الذي قبضته، الميزة التي قبضتها حماس من وراء؟
Well, come on. The interviewer is suggesting to al-Badawil that Hamas is profiting from the deaths of young teenagers. Of course al-Badawil is going to say, no, we're not using kids as cannon fodder. It's our own jihadists who are being martyrs to the cause. He'd say the earth was flat if it would make Hamas look good in the eyes of the Gazan people. So let's get this straight. A bunch of pro-Israel activists have actually chosen to believe Hamas over their beloved Israeli defense forces, and on the basis of a completely uncorroborated figure, they've not only demonized a group of probably well-meaning tree huggers, but they've managed to shame Daniel Sugarman from the JC into making a grovelling apology. And yes, Stephen Pollard, the editor, was almost as contrite. Now don't get me wrong, maybe the IDF were right to use live fire. Maybe they weren't. I honestly don't know. But what I do know is that nobody should be made to feel guilty for asking questions or for wanting to know whether it's really necessary to kill a human being. Some of those shots certainly were terrorists. A few could have been innocent children, journalists doing their job, or others simply caught up in the conflict. But what about a 15-year-old lad who's maybe lost loved ones in bombing raids during Operations Cast Lead and Protective Edge, who's been indoctrinated from birth into blaming Israel for everything that's so awful in his life, whose only contact with an Israeli has been at the other end of a gun barrel, terrified during an incursion. If he ran towards the border with a kite or a Molotov cocktail, then I wouldn't agree with him, and I probably wouldn't take part in a protest in Parliament Square, but I'd gladly say Kaddish for him.